Hello, this is the UCLA Housing Voice podcast, and I am your host, Shane Phillips. Our co-host today is Paavo Mankinen, and our interview features Professor Nicholas Marantz and Dr. Huixin Zheng of UC Irvine. As we've mentioned in recent episodes, California cities are in the process of updating their 8-year housing plans in a state-mandated document known as the Housing Element. This approach, where cities have to plan for a predetermined number of units reserved for low and moderate income households, as well as unrestricted market rate units, is really just one strategy for managing growth and trying to improve housing affordability. In a number of Northeastern states, they take a very different approach that doesn't involve much planning. Instead, they set low-income housing goals for their cities and give developers a variety of streamlining options, appeals, and exemptions to help them build affordable homes in those cities if their goals are not being met. The planning and appeals-based approaches both have strengths and weaknesses, and as we discussed, there's a lot of variation even within each of those categories. The 4 Northeastern states that Nick and Echo evaluate in one of their studies all fall under the appeals-based system category, but the way they design and enforce their programs makes a real difference for production of affordable homes, and the same could be said for planning-focused strategies like those in California. Even for us, this is a weedsy topic, but it's also an extremely important one because these state mandates have a huge impact on the overall production of housing, the amount of housing built specifically for low and moderate income households, and the distribution of that housing between different jurisdictions and between higher and lower resource neighborhoods within jurisdictions. Understanding how different states try to achieve these goals and how successful those efforts have been or not is really essential for those of us who care about housing affordability and equity. I learned a ton from this interview and these papers, and I am sure you will too. The Housing Voice podcast is a production of the UCLA Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies, and you can contact me with questions or research paper ideas at shanephillips@ucla.edu. Or you can just tweet at me. All right, let's talk to Nick and Echo.
All right, well, I'm so excited to welcome our 2 guests to the podcast this week. Nicholas Marantz, Associate Professor at the UC Irvine School of Social Ecology, and Huixin Zheng, a postdoctoral researcher at UCI as well. Welcome to the podcast, and thanks so much for joining us to talk about this extremely weedsy, esoteric topic that is state housing planning systems and their impacts.
Thanks for the invitation.
Thanks for having us.
And then Shane, you want to ask them a provocative question to get us going?
Yes, very, very provocative, one we've asked before. So we try to ask this, we're trying to make it more of a consistent thing. If you were giving us a tour of your city, what would be the number one thing, the top thing you'd want to show us? And you're in Irvine, which is an interesting place. So you can choose to make it an Irvine tour, or it can be, wherever you're from, somewhere you've lived in the past, totally up to you.
Okay, yeah, sure. Well, I'm living in Irvine right now, but I actually want to take you to the city where I went to high school for, Guangzhou. So it's a Chinese city in southern part of China. And Paavo, you're doing the wave. I assume you've been there or not?
Yeah, I love Guangzhou.
Paavo's very excited.
Fantastic city. I used to go there frequently.
Yeah, so first thing, we're going to get some OG dim sum, so awesome dim sum places. And food aside, we're going to try the metro system. Of course, not during the peak hour. Peak hour is extremely packed, but other than that, I would say the transportation system is very convenient and clean and really nice. That's how I got around during my 3 years high school there. And it's also fun to just walk around random residential areas. You will find yourselves surrounded by 30 to 50-story buildings in like a really nice complex. So it's a totally different urban vibe from urban areas in the United States, especially here in Irvine.
And we could make this a South China podcast instead of state housing planning in the United States, because I want to talk about the urban village redevelopment stuff. I don't know if you've been following all the different ways.
I read that paper.
We could put some stuff in the show notes. There's some really interesting redevelopment stuff. And have you been on the high-speed rail to Hong Kong? It was completed, I don't know, 5 years ago or something or more?
No, I've ridden the metro or train,
Right,
however
the
it's
normal
called in
train.
Hong Kong. Yeah, but probably not the high-speed rail. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hong Kong is really packed though, like next level packed compared to cities in mainland China.
But surprisingly livable, I would say. Like you, from the outside, it seems hyper dense, but it's a livable city. Sorry.
Because you can do a lot there. It's really fun.
Nick?
All right. Well, I'm going to take you around Irvine.
Yes. I was hoping one of you would.
And I'm just going to tell you what I actually do when folks are visiting Irvine, which is I take them to Crystal Cove State Park, which is a short drive from the Irvine campus. And it's a stretch of beautiful preserved beach and inland chaparral canyons. And there's a slight housing angle because there are a bunch of old beach shacks that have been preserved, and some of which have been refurbished, and some of which are in the process of being refurbished. And so it's a great walk and a great place to clear your head after you've spent a day working on complex issues of state housing policy.
You could just reflect on how ineffective it has been in that area. So we're going to be talking about, this is going to be a little bit of an odyssey here today. We're talking about a couple papers authored by Nick and Echo and a report that they co-authored, all of which address this issue of state intervention in housing plans in different ways. And so state intervention here in California has really become kind of central to how we approach housing policy in recent years, with laws that make it easier to build accessory dwelling units, changes to the regional housing needs assessment, and the housing element that are requiring cities to plan for more housing than they did in the past. Most recently, we have Senate Bill 9, which allows up to 4 homes to be built on most single-family zone parcels in the state. There's a lot to learn from our own state's history, I think, but we're not the first to, resort to state intervention, especially when it comes to planning for low-income housing. And so to get us started, I think it'd be helpful, just to get a primer on why places have resorted to state intervention in the first place. Housing and land use policy have traditionally been left to local governments, as we know, with state governments mostly not interfering with local decisions, especially on things like zoning. So what have been some of the consequences of this deference to local control? Like, what's at stake here?
Yeah, so one of the direct consequences that we don't have enough housing to be built because in general there is strong local opposition to housing, and what's at stake is that housing gets really expensive, and I'm sure we all know about that. We live in Southern California, and if you look at the Bay Area, that's even more expensive. And you have other related consequences like people have to commute really long to their work oftentimes because they don't find housing affordable that's near to their jobs or other everyday locations. And in areas like Southern California, people often have to double up with other family members or non-family members to lower the cost of housing, and that could potentially have like a public health implication, especially like these days in COVID time, and you live in a crowded housing unit.
Yeah, of the top 1% most overcrowded census tracts or zip codes in the country, about half of them are just in Southern California alone. So we have a really severe overcrowding problem for sure.
I would also add that there's a civil rights and a civil rights angle here as well, in that local land use regulation has been used as a tool of racial and ethnic segregation, in addition to income-based segregation. And so state intervention might be necessary in order to undo that legacy of racist local land use regulation.
Yeah. And so to address at least some of these issues, a few different models for state planning or state intervention have evolved over time. And our colleague at UC Davis, Chris Elmendorf, he refers to these as the Northeastern model and the West Coast model. But as Pavo has said and others have said, there is a lot of overlap between these two approaches. So several Northeastern states use what you call state affordable housing appeal systems, or SAHAS. I don't know if you say SAHAS or what here, but I'm just going to say appeal systems maybe from now on. And they have these to make sure that low-income housing gets built, and it's actually distributed across jurisdictions. So it's not just about building enough of it, but making sure it's built in a diversity of places, and high-income places as well as low-income places. So can you give us an overview of these different approaches, this sort of Northeastern model and the West Coast model?
Sure. I think the simplest difference is the West Coast model tends to rely very heavily on planning, whereas the Northeastern model doesn't necessarily involve planning at all. And so in one of the papers that we're going to be discussing today, we lay out 4 attributes of an appeals system. So the first is that if a local government hasn't fulfilled its fair share housing obligations, and these are obligations that are established by state law, then proposed projects that have below market rate housing don't need to comply with local zoning requirements, right? So that's pretty important. So, for example, a multifamily project might be built in an area zoned for single-family use.
Insert mind-blowing emoji for Californians here.
What could be worse?
Yeah, I think that's something that's underappreciated by Californians, is that, this is happening in Massachusetts.
Yeah. And so the second piece is that if a developer proposes a qualifying project, then that developer can request an expedited appeals procedure if the local government denies the proposal, or if the local government approves it, subject to conditions that render the project economically infeasible. Mm-hmm. That's important because time is money, in particular in real estate development, and this can really reduce developers' legal fees and carrying costs. And so the third feature is that there's a shifting of the burden of proof. So normally in land use law, there's a presumption that local government's actions are valid. Under an appeals system like the ones that we're describing, that presumption shifts. So the local government has to demonstrate that its regulations are valid, rather than the developer having to show that the regulations are invalid. So that favors the developer, means that the developer is more likely to win. And then what happens when the developer wins is also really important. When the developer wins, the developer generally is entitled to a building permit. So you could challenge a local zoning ordinance and win, and then the court would say, well, the local government has to change its zoning. Well, that's not a win for the project, because then the local government goes back, revises its zoning ordinance, takes a while to do that, and maybe the revised zoning ordinance isn't revised in a way that makes the project feasible.
So how does that compare? So that's sort of the Northeastern model.
Yeah.
In the case of the West Coast or California style, at least until recently, is it more just, we say you have to make plans for this, and then it's just sort of up in the air after that? There's not a lot of follow-up? Is that kind of our approach here?
Yes. I mean, it has been until recently.
Yeah, I would say there are more follow-ups than before, slightly more. But in California is mostly a planning mandate. So the state government imposes this housing obligation, and then local governments need to plan for this housing target or obligation. And actually, there are many detailed requirements in state laws in terms of how these plans need to be generated, if that counts as part of the follow-up. But these requirements are fairly new. I think they were slowly added to state laws beginning in 2017.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, so I've just been teaching a class on this topic, and I came up with what I think is a useful historical anecdote to kind of separate the two in people's minds. So if you will, can we go back to 1969 and think about California and Massachusetts? Because California's housing element law started in 1969, and so did 40B, which was the first of these appeals systems. And California now is a Democratic stronghold, but in 1969, they were voting for Nixon, and it was a conservative state. And so the housing element law was actually started by the Building Industry Association. It was not an open up the suburbs kind of bill, which was, the Massachusetts 40B was a civil rights bill to directly attack snob zoning and open up these exclusionary suburbs. California's bill, I was thinking of a good analogy. It's like an open up the farmland bill, right? Because the idea of it was subdivision developers were mad at local governments putting a bunch of rules on them, and they wanted to develop vacant land, right? And
it's like
so
an
for
anti-green belt.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so for a long time, it was focused on making vacant land available to developers. And until now, it's finally become something like, with this idea of affirmatively furthering fair housing, and as we'll talk with kind of the way need is allocated later in the podcast, I think it's become something more like with a civil rights angle, but it definitely didn't start out that way.
Yeah, I did find that anecdote very useful.
Pete Wilson carried the bill. Reagan signed it. I mean, it's like this is like Dukakis. The history is fascinating because Dukakis doubled down on the 40B and threw money at it and kind of made it effective. And meanwhile, Reagan is over here in California not doing that.
I mean, those days were weird generally. The Nixon administration signed the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. There was some strange stuff going on back then. So we're going to finally get to the first paper here in a little detail. And that one is called State Affordable Housing Appeals Systems and Access to Opportunity, Evidence from the Northeastern United States. This was published in Housing Policy Debate. In this paper, you evaluate these appeal systems in 4 states: Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Jersey, and Rhode Island. And you also compare their outcomes to New York State, which does not have one of these affordable housing appeal systems. So what did you find there?
Well, we found that the evidence suggests that these systems increase the amount of deed-restricted below market rate housing. We found that the Massachusetts system is particularly effective. And we also found that it seems to be effective in putting affordable housing or making housing affordable to lower income households in higher income areas, higher income census tracts.
Right.
So that's the big takeaway from the paper, is that relative to nothing, the evidence suggests that these systems do something. Now, it's correlational evidence, right? Not causal evidence. So we can't be 100% sure that it is attributable to these systems and not something else. But the evidence is consistent with that account.
Yeah, and in Massachusetts, it had the highest percent of units that were income restricted for low income households in its high income neighborhoods as well, the upper income, upper middle income. Right. But I should say, we're still talking about it was around 4.5% to 5% of total units. And that was the best of the 4 states. And in Massachusetts, their 40B program, you have all of those rights given to developers that allow them to build, even if it doesn't, meet the local zoning requirements and so forth, only in cities that don't have at least 10% of their units income restricted, right?
Yes, and it's actually the now we're getting deep in the weeds.
That's what we're here for.
It's worse than that.
It's 10% of the units meet the requirements of the law. So if you have a mixed income rental project in which 75% of the units are market rate units, all of those units, all those market rate units and the below market rate units count towards the 10% thresholds.
Oh. But in this 4.5% to 5%, you're not counting those in that percentage, right? This is just for which cities are exempt from
to get out of it.
That's correct. Okay. That's one of the contributions of this paper.
I was going to point out that, you have to hit 10% to be exempt, and yet the average is a little under half of that in a lot of these cities. And so I was wondering, why aren't people building more? But it sounds like maybe a lot of them actually are hitting that 10% exemption. It's just or that threshold. It's just that many of those units are not actually affordable. They're just in projects that took advantage of this exemption.
Yeah, and there has been a lot of movement towards the 10% threshold measured as of 2010. So there's now that the 2020 census numbers are coming out, some municipalities that were above 10% may fall below 10%, but we'll have to see.
And I guess while we're on this 10% topic, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the data you use, because it's an interesting database and one that we don't have, I don't think, in California in terms of kind of numbers of affordable units by municipality as recorded by the state government.
Yeah. So we went to each state government and we basically said, can you share with us the number of below market rate deed restricted units in each municipality? New Jersey and Connecticut and Rhode Island all said sure. And Massachusetts said no. And the reason they said no is because of state privacy law that they believe they might have been violating if they gave us municipal level counts of deed restricted below market rate units. And so what they would give us were aggregated counts if we said, okay, well, these are the municipalities with
so you group them
above moderate incomes.
Okay, got it.
Interesting.
So you don't know how it broke down city by city. You just have the average.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Got it.
I think they actually group them for you, right, Nick? They just send you the aggregated data instead of a detailed data set.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So Massachusetts' approach seems to be the most effective across a variety of metrics. More below market rate units in high income and low poverty neighborhoods, more low income renters living in these areas, and fewer of them are actually rent burdened. What are the different things that Massachusetts is doing that you would attribute this to? And I'll just throw in one thing that I thought was interesting, kind of calls back to an earlier interview we did with Professor Minji Kim, is this. So the appeals are reviewed administratively rather than judicially. And I think this just kind of, you have people who it's their job to assess the, validity of these appeals. And they are actually experts in this and they've been doing it for a long time, as opposed to, how we do a lot of this in California is you throw it to a judge who maybe sees a few of these a year or every decade or whatever, and is not an expert on these. So this idea of, administrative or bureaucratic competence comes into play, but I know there's a lot more going on here.
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with the 4 attributes that Nick just described. And like you mentioned, the expedited administrative review. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing is for developers that win the appeals, they actually get the comprehensive permit. So it's a permit that consolidates everything you need from local government in order to build this project. And the timeline is fairly short for this process, because if you compare this timeline with like regular time frames of entitlement in California, it can take like 2 to 3 years to receive an entitlement, and an entitlement itself doesn't even authorize the construction of the unit. So
right, you still need the permit.
Yeah, so having that comprehensive building permit granted to developers, I think that's a very powerful provision here. And the other thing I want to mention is that in Massachusetts, there's something called Friendly 40B, which means that local government will work with developers to figure out a place and the kinds of projects that both parties are interested in building, because with the 40B system in in Massachusetts, local governments really have this strong incentive to try to receive immunity from builder's remedy on its own term. There are probably similar things in other states, but I just like the sound of Friendly 40B in Massachusetts.
Can't we all get along?
Yeah, I think that's a great list. The one thing I would add, if we're comparing Massachusetts to the other Northeastern states is that the standard in Massachusetts is pretty simple, right? It's this 10% threshold. And so in New Jersey, which has a long history with affordable housing appeal systems, the standard is very complicated, and there's long been a very complicated procedure for determining how many units a municipality is obliged to accommodate, and that results in appeals and litigation about municipal obligations. And so it's helpful, I think, to have this admittedly arbitrary but simple standard. And I think that's one of the things that has led to the relative effectiveness of the Massachusetts system. Another thing that I think is worth mentioning is that the Massachusetts system, I think, is very good, relatively good, at generating what I would call middle income housing. It's middle income. There's middle income market rate housing, which is in these projects, but also the deed restricted units only have to be affordable at 80% of area median income, right? So we're not talking about units that are affordable to households with extremely low incomes. Now, in conjunction with housing vouchers, maybe those units become affordable to households with extremely low incomes. But one consequence of that is that these projects can pencil for developers, right? Because the below market rate units are subsidized almost entirely by the market rate units in these projects. So there's not a lot of financial public subsidy coming into these projects.
Yeah. And I think in Massachusetts you can be exempt, or you can take advantage of this if your project is at least 25% affordable, right?
It's 25% affordable at 80% of AMI, or 20% affordable at, I think, 50% of AMI. But tellingly, developers take advantage much more frequently of the 25% affordable at 80% of AMI.
Yeah, I think, and for the California listeners that are involved with our process, and for me in particular, that has seen how cities use the complexity of our process to game outcomes and lobby outcomes, I think that simplicity theme is really important to highlight. Not only the simplicity, like you mentioned, in where it applies, like where the builder's remedy applies, but also in the builder's remedy itself. So, if you think about SB 35 here, that's kind of a very light version of what a builder's remedy could be. The overriding local zoning, and I don't think 40B has prevailing wage or other kind of requirements that SB 35 projects have to have. Also, Nick, I think you mentioned to me before, like the kind of spillover impacts of the standardized comprehensive permitting process. Is that something? Am I remembering that correctly? That other non-40B projects are able to use this as well?
Yeah. Well, so one of the things you hear a lot if you participate in debates about California housing policy is that developers are very reluctant to sort of challenge local governments with which they maybe have ongoing relationships. There's a group of developers, a set of developers in Massachusetts that basically 40B is sort of their bread and butter. It's to their advantage to be able to credibly threaten to use the 40B process to build a project in a municipality. This goes back to what Echo was saying before about friendly 40B projects, right? Municipalities have an incentive to work with developers to make sure that projects that are acceptable to local residents get built. But also, there's not the same disincentive to sort of go up for a developer to go up against a municipality, right? It can, in a sense, be a win-win for a developer. If a developer doesn't want to build a 40B project, they say, we're going to build a 40B project. If you don't let us build the project we want to build. and then
that's sort of the unfriendly 40B.
Yeah, their worst case scenario is that they build a 40B project, which from my perspective is the best case scenario, because then you get below market rate units in there as well.
Yeah.
So in terms of effectiveness compared to other Northeastern states, how do the details of the builder's remedy in Massachusetts, do you think, shape its effectiveness there? I mean, because in other states, the builder's remedy isn't as strong.
I don't think it's as much that the builder's remedy itself isn't as strong. It's that it's harder to get to the builder's remedy, or as in the case of Connecticut, you have to. So Connecticut requires some units to be affordable below 80% of
50 probably.
Yes, and 50. So it's harder to make projects pencil. Also, Connecticut, I believe, does not provide a comprehensive permit, right? So you still have to navigate multiple permitting processes in order to get the project approved.
Right.
And then in New Jersey, it's just frequently you end up arguing about what the municipality's responsibility to accommodate its fair share actually is.
Simplicity seems to be the name of the game. And I mean, not to be too critical of California's approach recently, because I think we're at least moving in the right direction in some respects, but we are certainly not making it less complicated in the recent years. So I think it's a good time to move on to the next paper because we still have a bit to get through. And this one is called Exclusionary Zoning and the Limits of Judicial Impact. And you both authored this as well and published it in the Journal of Planning, Education, and Research. Actually in 2018, about a little over a year before the paper we just talked about. But this one's looking at the judiciary's role in all of this and whether these kinds of fair share state interventions are less effective maybe, or maybe more, when they originate in the courts as opposed to the legislature. So you're comparing northern New Jersey to New York, which is just on the other side of the border and are part of the same metro area, and southern New Jersey with Philadelphia, which is also just same metro, but two sides of a border.
That's actually different metro. New Jersey is...
Oh, those are different metro areas?
Yeah.
Okay. In the case of Philadelphia?
2.
Yeah. New Jersey is such a cool state.
Oh, yeah. They're not... The northern and southern New Jersey are different metro areas, but the southern New Jersey and Philadelphia are the same, right?
Correct.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. If I didn't say that right, I
turns out a lot of Philadelphia is in New Jersey.
So New Jersey is important here because its affordable housing appeal system came out of the judiciary, out of the courts, and specifically two really well-known cases in planning world known as Mount Laurel 1 and Mount Laurel 2. So can you give us a little background on what those cases were about and how those shaped planning of below market housing in the state?
Sure, I could take this one.
You are the lawyer.
So the Mount Laurel case is a very famous case in land use law circles. And the Southern Burlington County NAACP sued the town of Mount Laurel. So this was very clearly a civil rights case. And the problem was that Mount Laurel was making it impossible to build a housing development that would have been affordable to families with low and moderate incomes. And so it went all the way up to the New Jersey Supreme Court. And the court provided a novel interpretation of the New Jersey state constitution. So the court said that a developing municipality, although the court didn't define what a developing municipality was, a developing municipality was obliged to affirmatively afford the possibility of low and moderate income housing development commensurate with its fair share of the regional need for low and moderate income housing. So we've got developing municipalities that have to, quote, affirmatively afford low and moderate income housing, potential for low and moderate income housing development commensurate with their, quote, fair share of the, quote, regional need. We've got these 4 undefined terms that the court says municipalities have to now abide by this ruling without giving a ton of guidance. And also in this first decision...
This is sounding kind of like CEQA to me. I'm getting like echoes of CEQA here.
This decision is issued in 1975, and there's also no builder's remedy that the court announces. So the court doesn't say what the remedy is. It just says that we expect that Mount Laurel and other municipalities will revise their zoning ordinances to accommodate low and moderate income housing. That expectation proved to be somewhat optimistic. And 8 years later, the court heard the Mount Laurel 2 case, and citing widespread noncompliance with the rule that it had announced in the first Mount Laurel decision, the court established a system that was intended to expedite adjudication of fair share disputes by lower courts, and it lowered the burden of proof for parties challenging exclusionary zoning ordinances, and it emphasized that the builder's remedy would be readily available. The court also said we would much rather that the legislature take care of this, but the legislature didn't take care of it, or at least hadn't taken care of it in the intervening 8 years. And so the court's hope here was to push the legislature to take some action.
Yeah, and I was talking with Pavo just before this about how it's strange how well known Mount Laurel is for all its complexity and based on the previous paper, not all that much effectiveness compared to the 40B, which prior to reading your paper, I don't think I'd ever heard of. So broadly speaking, since we're comparing this to New York and Pennsylvania, how does the approach in New Jersey, how they address exclusionary zoning in particular and below market and middle income housing, how does it differ from New Jersey's approach?
So in New York, the highest court in the state, also in 1975, the same year of the first Mount Laurel decision, issued a decision that sounded a lot like the Mount Laurel decision, Mount Laurel 1. Mm-hmm. But unlike the New Jersey State Supreme Court, the New York court never followed up that first decision with a second decision actually giving teeth to the ruling. And so New York's courts have basically not done anything to address the issue. In Pennsylvania, for a long time, even before the 1970s, Pennsylvania courts would require local governments that were in the path of urban development to accommodate a mix of land uses. Regardless of whether they accommodated deed-restricted below-market rate housing, they still had to accommodate a mix of land uses. It couldn't all be, for example, detached single-family housing. And that strain of judicial doctrine in Pennsylvania continued throughout the 1970s and into the 1980s and even beyond, with some twists and turns. So that's sort of the breakdown, right? You've got New Jersey, Mount Laurel, particularly after the Mount Laurel 2 decision in 1983, when the law gets some teeth. New York, nothing. And Pennsylvania, you've got builders' remedies for developers of multifamily housing, but that multifamily housing does not need to include deed-restricted below-market rate units.
Okay. And so for this paper, maybe that helps explain why, you were studying what you did in this paper, which was the production of apartments and townhomes. So not looking at below market or anything like that, just apartments and townhomes. And those were used because these housing types are a fairly good proxy for household income. The people who live in apartments and townhomes tend to have lower incomes than the residents of detached homes. So between these three areas, what differences did you find? Or I guess 4 areas. What did you find between New Jersey jurisdictions and those in New York and Philadelphia?
Yeah. So in New Jersey, we find that we saw a 27% increase in townhome stock relative to New York. So we're talking about northern New Jersey versus New York. Mm-hmm. And a 7% increase in apartment units in northern New Jersey relative to the New York state municipalities right across the border. We don't find any statistically significant differences between the southern New Jersey municipalities and Pennsylvania when we're looking at townhome and apartment production in the years following Mount Laurel 2 versus the years before Mount Laurel 2.
Yeah, can I just jump in and complement the research design of both of these papers? I think kind of budding scholars should check them out. I think they do a really good job of using this metropolitan areas that span 2 states to kind of assess what we can tell about the differences in housing development in those 2 states that have these different systems. And they're kind of very upfront about the non-experimental nature of this and the fact that, these are exogenous to the metropolitan activity, but like they're in 2 states. So they're facing different challenges that you can't control for. I wonder whether you had thoughts on kind of the New Jersey half of Philadelphia or the New Jersey section of New York, and other ways they differ that wouldn't be attributable to these the state level housing laws? How much did you worry about that when you were doing these projects?
Oh, quite a bit. We have some appendices dealing with some of the potential differences, and I mean, I think you're right, Pavo, that in general, we can't really say with certainty what it is about any given state that is driving variation, right? There are myriad differences in policy in particular when you're looking. Mm-hmm. I mean, one of the things that this cross-border comparison does pretty well, I think, is many of the socioeconomic forces driving the regional socioeconomic forces are the same, right? Because these jurisdictions are all in the same region. But of course, there are concerns about self-selection, right? That people live in New York State because they like some mix of the policies in New York State relative to the mix of policies in New Jersey, right across the border. And so that may sort of have impacts on housing development that are not necessarily attributable to, for example, the Mount Laurel decision. And so that's the kind of thing that we worry about and that we really can't control for. There are other things like tax rates that we can control for and that we do try to control for in the appendices. But yes.
Yeah, and in general, both papers take a somewhat similar strategy in terms of just comparing the differences between the two states within these metropolitan areas. And that's kind of the most effective figures that I saw were figures or tables were just kind of the raw data, kind of how has townhome development differed in these two places. But then you get into a regression framework where you look at, is it tract or municipal level variation? And I guess you do different ways to worry about it at a smaller geography and control for different things. So that I think is an effective approach.
That brings back a lot of memory, Nick. The New Jersey paper is the very first research project on state planning that I've worked on. And yeah, that kind of just opened the door for me.
Cutting your teeth on all the hard data work.
I mean, something that I sort of took away from this was, we've been debating here in California recently, should we have some kind of like constitutional amendment or law that says there is a constitutional right to housing? And I think, just in general terms, that sounds good, but it really shows, these cases really show that like the details matter a lot. And just saying that there's this right to housing, looking at it from the perspective of New Jersey versus in New York, like it can mean very different things. And in practice, the policies you assign to this, the obligations you assign, make all the difference in some respect. So
right.
Absolutely.
That was a big takeaway for me.
Well, and even with this paper where it's like, is the judiciary doing it and giving it to the legislature? But even when the legislature does it, like here, they're giving it to the bureaucracy. And so, I mean, that's, something that has been in the news of late, right? Is kind of, there's all these new laws governing California's housing element process, and then the bureaucracy's maybe not enforcing them.
Yeah, so let's move on to California.
Oh, segue.
And this will be a chance for Echo to comment a little more because she was the lead author on this one. So this is a report on, it's titled Accessibility, Affordability, and Allocation of Housing Targets to California's Local Governments. Both of you are authors, as well as Jae-Hong Kim and Doug Houston.
Or rather, Houston.
And so here in California, we have this system where the state forecasts population growth every 8 years. The housing needed to accommodate that growth gets divvied up between cities and unincorporated areas by regional governments as part of the Regional Housing Needs Assessment, or RHNA. Then every local government in the state has to create something called a housing element that lays out where all of that housing will go. For the whole, we're really seeing the lack of simplicity in our system already. And that...
Just hearing this introduction.
Yeah, the housing element has to identify specific sites that are viable for development or redevelopment. And so we've already kind of covered this a bit, so maybe just focusing on the differences here. But what does this, if anything, share with the Northeastern approach?
Yeah, I mean, one big similarity here is that you have housing obligations coming from the state to local governments. Even though the housing obligations are expressed in different forms, in California, it's like a planning target, and then in Massachusetts, it's like a percentage of the housing stock that needs to be affordable units. And the other similarity, if it counts, is that there are some sort of enforcement mechanisms in both types of state interventions that compel local governments to accommodate these housing obligations. So in California, like at least now, there are consequences of not producing a compliant housing plan. And in Massachusetts and other northeastern states, we've talked about it a lot. You have builder's remedy and this appeal system.
And then in terms of outcomes, since this is what we're really concerned with, where do we stand on this over, and maybe we should, focus on before the current cycle, before all of the reforms that have gone into place, what has the RHNA process, the housing element process in California produced?
Well, actually, before I get to outcome, let me just point out another differences. Because in California, the housing targets include below market rate housing and also market rate units. Whereas in the northeastern states, the housing targets are mainly below market rate units. So I think that's another difference scholars tend to point out a lot. And then in terms of outcomes, yeah, you're right. We don't really have data to assess the effectiveness of the current system, and hopefully we have. I think HCD is doing some work in the right direction in terms of collecting these different types of data. But looking at previous planning periods, I think the consensus is that the majority of the housing units that were built in previous planning periods did not occur in the sites that are included as suitable or available in their housing plan.
Shout out to Pavo and Chris Elmendorf and their
co-authors. To Salim and Sid, really.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, Chris came up with the idea. And I was going to say, we don't have a nice metropolitan area that sprawls into Arizona or Nevada, right? So we don't have this control
Lake
group
Tahoe.
that we can compare.
What are you talking about?
Yeah. Okay, sure. I know. I was actually talking to Chris Elmendorf yesterday about this in terms of rezonings as one of the tangible outcomes that we could expect from the housing element process, right? So if cities are forced to accommodate some housing in their plan and they don't have enough space, they need to rezone some land for more housing. And he had actually already asked HCD for data. They collected data on rezonings from the fifth cycle. And so a total across the state of 35,000 units space for 35 units were created through rezonings in the fifth cycle, right? The total housing need in the fifth cycle was 1 million units. So I mean, I don't think that's like a huge impact if we generated 35,000 more units of
Just
space.
to make sure everyone's on the same page, HCD is the Housing and Community Development Department. It's the state's housing department. And they are kind of charged with overseeing and enforcing these housing elements as they're developed and after they've been implemented.
Should we turn to the report?
Yeah. I did want to just add one more thing, though, which is that not only are, these plans not good at identifying places where development actually occurs, but they don't seem to be very effective at encouraging adequate development, with many cities having, I think by all of our standards anyway, targets that were too low, production targets that were not sufficient to meet the growing demand, and still failing to meet those targets by a very wide margin in most places. With the exception of Beverly Hills, got to give them credit. They did meet their target of 3 housing units in 8 years.
They blew past their target.
Well,
success.
Good luck on the next cycle.
Yes.
Keep up the good work.
I think their target, because it was obviously politically manipulated and way too low last time, I'm pretty sure it's about 1,000 times higher now, which is a little more appropriate. So, Pavo, did you want to ask this question about the different approaches?
Sure. So let's turn to the report. I think it's a great analysis and a really kind of important big picture analysis. I'm really glad you did it. It has two parts. So the first part, you compare the allocation method in Southern California. So can maybe you summarize the way that the regional government allocated housing and the two approaches you compare it to?
Yeah, so in the report, I'm looking at the approach generated by SCAG.
We're getting into dangerous acronym territory.
Southern California Association of Government. Okay. Right. So generally speaking, this allocation approach incorporates so many different criteria or indicators, such as accessibility of jobs, accessibility of transit, projected population growth, which is generated by a different government agency, and many other indicators that I can memorize them all. But these indicators are served as proxy for demands. So basically, they have a formula, plug in these indicators, and then they come up with measures for housing demands in different local municipalities. And based on these existing and projected housing needs, they allocate the housing targets to each local government in the SCAG region in Southern California. So this is the approach they took. Pablo, do you have a question?
No, yeah. So then you in your work, you compare it to other potential approaches to see how effective they would have been.
Yeah. So we just come up with two other much simpler approach. One of them, we call it the 20% rule, which pretty much resembles Massachusetts' 10% threshold. So we're saying the target will be set as 20% of the housing stock as of 2010. And then the other approach, we slightly modified this 20% rule. We have these indicators of job accessibility, and we rank the municipalities based on their job accessibilities. And then basically for the top half of the municipalities in this ranking, we set the housing targets as 25% of local housing stock as of 2010. And for the other half, we set a slightly lower housing target, which is, I believe, 15% of local housing stock as of 2010. So we have these three different approaches and look at how the allocation outcomes under each allocation method correlate with different local characteristics that we're interested in, such as access to jobs, access to transit, and access to high opportunity areas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this how fair is the fair share allotment that cities are getting question. And so what did you find? Was the complicated method superior to the simple method?
How could it not be?
Well, surprisingly, it's not the most superior method, the complicated one. So what we found is that under the more complicated multi-criteria allocation scenario, the outcomes are not really associated with transit accessibility anymore in a regression context. So that's after we control for several other local characteristics. So even though transit accessibility is one indicator used in this allocation process, but when we look at the allocation outcome, it's not really strongly correlated with transit accessibility. That's one thing. And the other issue we found is that a set of high income cities in the region actually get a much lower average allocation outcomes compared to lower income municipalities. And that's potentially problematic because income is an important proxy for socioeconomic opportunity.
Mm-hmm. And just to make sure I'm understanding this correctly, you're looking at the allocations that were actually made for the first one. And so in the case of SCAG, if I'm understanding like timing correctly, this is after we had this whole local fight about, there was the initial plan where a lot more housing was allocated inland in San Bernardino County and Riverside County. And then kind of surprisingly, a lot of local politicians here stood up and said, no, we should actually have more housing in Los Angeles and Orange County and places like that. So this outcome where you're finding that it was not really associated with transit accessibility and things like that, that was after we moved a lot of the housing inland or toward the coasts. So even after that, the outcomes were still not good.
Yeah, that's what the press called the coastal plan. And that was released in March 2020. And we know there was an appeal process that came after, even though there wasn't that much change made to the initial allocations.
Yeah, actually, so I had a question about that. So you did use the final plan because, in that plan, my big problem with it was 40% of the need was still allocated based on like the way they had done things in the past at SCAG, which was this local inputs process, which was like a black box that basically asked cities how much they intended to grow and then use that as their housing target. So I think it would be interesting to look at just the job, because the other 60% was assigned based on jobs accessibility and transit accessibility. And so did you break that apart at all?
Not in this report, but for the other allocation scenario that I constructed, the third one that I mentioned, which considered job accessibility in the allocation process. That one, we found positive correlations between the allocation outcomes and job accessibility, and we don't see that municipalities at different income levels are receiving significantly different allocation outcomes. So for that, I think it's an improvement compared to the multi-criteria allocation outcomes. And it's also much more administratively simpler.
Yeah. And I wonder whether you either of you have perspectives on the other regional approaches to this problem. I mean, one feature of the California system is that regional governments get to invent their own methodology for allocating housing within their region, and so every San Diego, Sacramento, Bay Area are taking different approaches. Have you looked into those, and do you have any thoughts?
I've briefly looked into those. I know the Bay Area is still in the process of finalizing their allocations, but correct me if I'm wrong. I've looked at San Diego and also other slightly smaller regions that did the allocations before SCAC did it, because different regions also have different timelines, and some of the regions don't really need to do it right now. So a lot of other regions also use this multi-criteria method, but is not as complicated as the one that SCAG is using for this cycle. But like this multi-criteria formula, it's like a norm adopted by regional government.
And I think sort of more broadly, it's easy to understand the appeal of these multi-criteria methods, right? The world is really complicated, and we want to take into account all of these different considerations in policymaking processes. But I think one thing that our work highlights is that there are trade-offs between complexity and simplicity, obviously, but one thing that can get lost is by taking into account all of these different considerations, you may end up with less housing in general, and in particular, less deed-restricted below market rate housing than you would with a simpler approach that maybe doesn't take into account the infinite complexity.
So like a one-size-fits-all approach.
Yeah, well, let's say more like you go into the store and you buy the pair of pants that fits you more closely rather than going to a tailor to get a custom made.
I do think, to give credit to the RHNA housing element process here in California, I do think you could say one drawback of the just we're going to shoot for 10% or whatever percent of housing to be income restricted is that doesn't really respond to future demand more broadly. Because you could just say, well, we're going to build nothing except income restricted housing until we get to that threshold. But that's not actually the only housing that's needed. And, there's demand for these places to grow. And so I could go down the list of reasons California's approach is bad and has all these problems. But I do think that seems like one strength. I guess this just gets back to the fact that ours is very planning based, and there is a role for planning in all of this. And maybe it shouldn't just be looking at, percentages at the end of the day.
Right.
Yeah. Or it shouldn't be 10% of your housing has to be deed restricted. It should be maybe up to 20% of your housing stock. If you're not accommodating up to 20% of your housing, an additional 20% of housing stock as compared to 10 years ago, then there's some kind of access to a builder's remedy. I mean, I think there are a lot of different ways to structure a simpler rule. I certainly don't think that the state affordable housing appeal system is, by any stretch of the imagination, the best way to do it. But I do think it sort of points to some of the benefits of simpler approaches.
For a planning approach, to work well, it really depends on whether all local governments are genuinely wanting to plan for more housing. Otherwise, you just have more way to be creative to do what you want to achieve your agenda.
Yeah, and I mean, it brings up a lot of issues also with kind of historical legacy of where transit is located and kind of where the job centers are. I think that maybe something, if people are still interested in this topic, the Paris example is also quite interesting. They have a 20% below market rate type approach to municipalities in Paris, but it's also coupled with funding. I mean, that's one thing that the California's process reveals is we definitely don't have enough money to build all the housing need that we've allocated for in terms of low-income units across the state. There's a good paper by Yona Freemark that we can put in the show notes about the Paris approach, because I want to turn now to the second half of the report where you analyze implementation, which is, I think, an interesting approach. And so you look at both the need and the enforcement, considering three types of enforcement: planning mandates, zoning reform mandates, and zoning overrides. So maybe first you can tell us about those three approaches and then kind of how you illustrate the differences with two case studies.
Yeah, so planning mandates it's a mandate that requires local governments to plan for housing. Like in California, they are required to generate a housing plan to illustrate how they're going to accommodate future housing growth. And zoning reform mandates in states like California and also Minnesota, they require that local zoning regulations need to be consistent with their housing plans. So that's like one step ahead. So in addition to generate these local housing plans, you need to bring your local land use and zoning policies inconsistent with your plans. And then for zoning overrides is something that we've talked about, like in Massachusetts, developers of qualifying projects can bypass local zoning regulations and move forward their projects.
So like an appeal system. And so with the zoning reform mandates, examples would you consider the ADU legislation a zoning reform mandate, or is this more like a SB 50 overriding zoning near transit approach?
I would say in California, the example is that when you update your local housing plans and you realize you need additional zoning capacity to accommodate your housing targets, then you are required to
rezone.
You're required to rezone.
And then, so you compare Fullerton and the city of Orange, both located in Orange County, interesting places, and kind of maybe tell me about the context of the two cities and what you found in terms of the three approaches there.
Yeah, these two cities just really stood out when I look at their RHNA allocations, which are very different. But these two cities are socioeconomically very similar to each other. They have similar population size, similar level of median household income, and they both have commuter rail. And when I look at the number, they have similar level of job accessibility. And My family lives in Anaheim, so I know they are really close to each other. So when I see that their arena numbers are drastically different, it just caught my attention. So Fullerton, so with all these similarities, Fullerton received arena allocation of over 13,000, and Orange, the city of Orange, received an allocation of under 4,000. So,
Wow.
and that comes from the multi-criteria.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think there must have been a lot of this local input affecting those numbers. Orange, I also noticed in your descriptive statistics, Orange is a lot whiter than Fullerton and slightly richer. So
Maybe slightly wider.
But I believe, I believe that the reduction was due to the putative equity adjustment.
Yeah, so
SCAG imposed.
Yeah, so what happened is that the city of Orange have slightly more than 50% of the population that lived in these areas that are considered as low resourced, high poverty, and segregated.
Mm-hmm.
So GAG applied this equity adjustment and significantly reduced the allocation targets for the city of Orange.
Yep, interesting.
But I think it again shows how these efforts to tailor policy, even to address equity concerns, can potentially not function in the way you want, right? If a city is very segregated, then some areas are gonna show up as higher segregation. That's gonna potentially make the equity adjustment results in lower units, almost going against that.
Right. And when the kind of subunits or the subunits of the allocation, the cities are very diverse in terms of their composition. If they were all homogenous, then it would be easy to allocate. I mean, this is something that's come up within the city of LA, which was like very sure, we can take a lot of housing need. We'll take half of the region's housing need, but then they just put it all downtown or kind of avoid certain neighborhoods. So bigger cities and kind of more segregated cities are more easily able to accommodate this need without affecting their rich constituents. So then what did you find in terms of the three implementation approaches in these two places?
So in the analysis, I actually just look at two implementation approaches. The first one, I call it housing plan standards. So this one assumes that developers can just build on areas that are designated for multifamily use and the appropriate densities. So I basically look at what current plans in these two cities, what sites are designated for multifamily use, and then in the scenario, I have this high density scenario which developers can build at 25 units per acre, and I have this low density scenarios which developers can build at 15 units per acre. And there are different thresholds of development probability. So these are all just hypothetical numbers to get an idea how many units could potentially be built on the sites that are designated for multifamily use in current general plans. So this is the first implementation scenario. And for the second implementation scenario, I looked at something called targeted zoning override. So basically, we have areas that are defined as near jobs and transit. And then in these areas, we look at parcels or sites that are currently not designated for multifamily use. And we assume that developers can override the zoning designations in these non-multifamily use parcels and build their project. And based on that assumption, we estimate the development of potential in these areas. So what we get is that if we go by the general plan standards for implementation, the development potential will be much lower than the development potential estimated for a targeted zoning override implementation scenario, which is probably to be expected. And for in the case of Fullerton, with a RHNA number of over 13,000, the city needs to substantially rezone to higher density in order to meet this RHNA number.
Mm-hmm.
It will be slightly easier for this in the case of the city of Orange, but still, if we only go by this general plan standards, they can only meet this. The city of Orange can only meet its obligation when the development probability is high in the city.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So this idea of if rezoning doesn't happen, there's no impact, and then kind of where does the rezoning happen? And I guess the kind of the virtue of the current process is that there is local control about where rezoning happens, versus kind of a top-down, forced rezonings near transit or something. But if they don't do the rezoning, then there will be no impact.
Yeah, if they don't do the rezoning, then what?
Right.
That's what we're about to find out, I think, in a lot of our cities.
Cliffhanger. Stay tuned for the next 2 years.
Well, I think we've completed our odyssey here from the Northeast and back. Is there anything we missed? There's so much here. Is there any kind of summing up thoughts either of you have on all of this work and how it all fits together?
I mean, I think just to circle back to what I said at the beginning, there are really sort of two ways of thinking about state intervention. Broadly speaking, I think there is intervention on the planning side and intervention on the building side, and they don't necessarily need to be paired, right? You could allow for more building without requiring local governments to do any more planning. That is, in fact, what we see in Massachusetts. That's an approach that hasn't really been much considered in California, and in fact, I think in many Western states. And so I think that sort of that dichotomy helps to sort of frame these much more complicated policy debates in thinking about sort of how we might want to facilitate development of housing sufficient to ensure or at least improve affordability for many people.
I know that California is not the only place that debates local control. It's something that's being talked about and debated everywhere, but it does seem like our approach is sort of designed to retain it as much as possible, even when the state intervenes. So it's not just saying, developers can build wherever they want if you're not meeting these targets. It's saying, you have to build a lot of housing. A lot of it has to be at these affordability levels, but we're still going to leave it in your hands to determine what that looks like. And so, again, I guess we'll see how that turns out. But I think that's an important distinction there.
Yeah, but I think that's also where the conundrum in California kicks in, because you have this system designed to be retained as much as local control or flexibility as possible. But then you also have these different layers of requirements and rules saying that how you're going to present your site inventory, how you're going to rezone your properties, when this needs to be done. And if all these are not done, you're going to have these consequences. Like, you have all these requirements on the one hand, and then on the other hand, you're saying like you can still plan for your own community. And in my interviews with local planners and council members, I really feel like they are scratching their head in terms of how they're gonna get this done. And to me, this is just like a very this. I don't know how this conflict can be resolved in the system, but it's really intriguing.
Fodder for a future paper.
Yeah, it's hard not to get depressed. I wish SB 35 was more like 40B in terms of zone, because SB 35 as the punishment, the projects still need to be zoning compliant. I think if they didn't have to be zoning compliant, then it would be a much more effective stick.
Yeah, to me, SB 35 really sort of sums up the one of the major problems with housing in California, which is the SB 35 is a big deal because it compels municipalities to approve projects that already comply with their zoning.
Please just follow the law. Yeah, that's all we ask. Okay, well, Echo and Nick, thank you so much for joining today.
Yeah, thanks so much, and thanks for the great research. We'll link to everything, and I recommend people check it out.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You can learn more about Dr. Marantz and Dr. Zheng's research and find our show notes and a transcript of the interview at our website, lewis.ucla.edu. The UCLA Lewis Center is on Facebook and Twitter. I'm on Twitter at Shane D. Phillips, and you can find Pavo there at El Pavo. Thanks for listening to the UCLA Housing Voice podcast, and thanks for telling your friends, family, colleagues, students, and passersby about us, and for stealing their phones and subscribing them to the show without their knowledge. Whatever it takes. See you next time.